There is a moment in the book of Genesis that feels like the narrative suddenly pauses, not because the story ends, but because something entirely unexpected enters it. In the middle of the well-structured account of Abraham, his journey, his covenant, his unfolding relationship with the divine, an entirely different figure appears without warning. His name is Melchizedek. And yet, he arrives without any of the things that normally define a biblical character. No genealogy, no recorded origin, no narrative conclusion. It is as if he steps out of a place that the text itself refuses to describe, acts for a brief moment within the story, and then disappears back into silence. In the ancient world of biblical tradition, genealogy is not a minor detail, it is the foundation of legitimacy. Who you are is determined by where you come from. Authority is inherited, not assumed. Lineage is everything. And yet Melchizedek stands completely outside that system. He has no ancestry to validate him, no tribal affiliation to situate him. And still, he appears with a level of authority that the narrative does not question, but rather recognizes. This creates an immediate tension. How can someone without lineage possess authority greater than those whose identity is carefully documented and covenantally defined? And more importantly, does his appearance suggest that the priestly structure later associated with the Levites is not the only form of spiritual authority in the biblical worldview? If you find these deeper structural questions compelling, consider subscribing and following the channel. What we are really exploring here is not just ancient narrative, but the hidden architecture of authority embedded within sacred texts, where a single unnamed figure can quietly challenge entire systems of tradition. From this point, a central thesis begins to emerge. Melchizedek is not an accidental anomaly in the text. He functions instead as a foundational prototype, a primordial model of a priesthood that exists beyond time, beyond genealogy, and potentially even beyond the later institutional structures that dominate biblical history. The story then pulls us back into the moment of his first appearance. After a military conflict, Abraham returns with victory and exhaustion. It is at this precise point, in a moment of transition between war and rest, that Melchizedek appears in Salem. There is no dramatic introduction, no divine announcement, just an encounter that feels almost understated, yet carries enormous theological weight. He is identified in two roles simultaneously, King of Salem and Priest of God Most High. In the ancient world, these roles are normally separated. Kings govern political order, priests mediate spiritual order. Power is divided so that no single figure embodies both domains. But Melchizedek collapses that separation entirely. He does not simply rule, he blesses. And more importantly, he blesses Abraham. This detail is critical. In biblical logic, the one who gives the blessing is greater than the one who receives it. The hierarchy is quietly reversed. Abraham, the recipient of divine promises, is positioned beneath a figure who appears without lineage or institutional backing. The narrative intensifies further when Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything he has. This is not merely generosity, it is recognition of authority. It is a symbolic acknowledgement that something higher is present. When this is contrasted with the structure of the Levites, the difference becomes stark. The Levitical system is built entirely on heredity. Priestly authority is not earned, chosen, or demonstrated, it is inherited. One must prove descent from Levi to serve at the altar. Lineage is not symbolic, it is legal requirement. Authority is biologically bounded. Melchizedek stands entirely outside this framework. He is not from Levi. He is not even part of any identifiable genealogical system in the text. And yet, paradoxically, he exercises a form of authority that even Abraham acknowledges. This leads to a deeper theological implication. Authority in the biblical imagination may not be exclusively biological or hereditary. Instead, there appears to be another category of legitimacy, one that does not depend on ancestry, but on essence. Melchizedek, then, is not simply a mysterious figure inserted into a narrative. He becomes a signpost, a structural clue suggesting that beneath the visible system of lineage-based priesthood lies an older and more fundamental order, one that is not generated by bloodline, but by a reality that transcends it. And from this perspective, the appearance of Melchizedek is not an interruption in the story of Genesis. It is a revelation of something deeper, a hidden architecture of authority that quietly runs beneath the surface of biblical history itself. Centuries after the strange encounter between Abraham and the mysterious king-priest of Salem, the figure of Melchizedek fades from direct narrative memory. In the text of the book of Genesis, he appears only briefly, almost like a shadow that crosses a lit path and then disappears again into silence. And yet, silence in biblical literature is never truly empty, because what disappears from narrative often reappears in interpretation. It is in this interpretive space that Melchizedek returns, not as a historical figure, but as a prophetic echo. In the Psalms, long after the age of Abraham, the voice of David emerges with a declaration that feels almost like a key turning inside an ancient lock. "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." This single line in Book of Psalms is not merely poetic praise, it is structurally disruptive. Because for the first time, Melchizedek is no longer a silent anomaly in Genesis. He becomes a reference point for a new category of authority, one that is described as eternal. The phrase "forever" immediately challenges the foundations of the existing priestly system. In the world shaped by the Levites, priesthood is strictly temporal. It is bound to mortality, inherited through lineage, and replaced generation after generation. No priest serves indefinitely. Death is built into the system as a structural requirement for continuity. But now, the psalm introduces something entirely different. A priesthood that does not end. A priesthood that does not pass from father to son. A priesthood that is not interrupted by death. And more importantly, a priesthood defined not by Levi, but by Melchizedek. At this point, the narrative tension that began in Genesis begins to expand into a full structural contradiction. The ancient system divides authority into two separate lines. Kingship belongs to the tribe of Judah. Priesthood belongs to the tribe of Levi. These two lines are not meant to intersect. They are designed to remain parallel, ensuring that political power and spiritual mediation never concentrate in a single figure. This separation is not accidental. It is foundational to the stability of the covenantal order. And yet the psalm attributed to David introduces a figure who collapses that boundary entirely. A priest, who is also a king. Not temporarily, not symbolically, but forever. This is where the conceptual rupture becomes unavoidable. Because the statement does not merely describe a different individual, it describes a different kind of order altogether. A priesthood, according to the order of Melchizedek, implies that Melchizedek is not just a person in the past, but the origin of a structural category that exists outside the Levitical system. In other words, David is not introducing novelty. He is revealing continuity with something older than the established institutional framework. The implications are profound. If a king can also be a priest, then the entire separation of roles that defines Israel's religious and political architecture is no longer absolute. It becomes provisional, functional, historical. This creates a direct tension with the inherited system of law and worship. The Levitical priesthood, which depends on genealogical legitimacy and ritual continuity, suddenly faces the possibility of a parallel authority structure that does not rely on those conditions at all. A new model begins to emerge, not authority derived from descent, but authority derived from permanence, not legitimacy grounded in lineage, but legitimacy grounded in being. And this is where the contradiction deepens into crisis. Because if such a priesthood exists, even in prophetic form, then the existing system is not necessarily false, but incomplete. It functions within time, but it cannot contain what is described as eternal. The result is a structural pressure within the theological imagination of Israel. Two systems of authority begin to coexist in tension. One is historical, regulated, and inherited. The other is timeless, unified, and singular. And the more the Psalmic declaration is contemplated, the more it destabilizes the assumption that divine order must be distributed across separate human institutions. Instead, it introduces the possibility that ultimate authority, both political and spiritual, may converge in a single unified figure who does not belong to the traditional genealogical map at all. This is not merely theological abstraction, it is a direct challenge to the logic of the covenantal world. Because the covenant itself is built on structure, division, and mediated access. But the order, according to Melchizedek, implies immediacy, unity, and permanence. The system begins to strain under the weight of its own categories. And what started as a brief, mysterious appearance in Genesis now becomes a prophetic fracture line running through the entire biblical narrative. The question is no longer who Melchizedek was. The question becomes what kind of order he represents, and whether the existing framework can fully contain it. When the declaration in the Book of Psalms about a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek begins to circulate within the theological memory of Israel, an implicit but increasingly weighty question arises alongside it. If there exists a priestly order that surpasses the current system, what does that imply for the system already in operation? The answer does not emerge immediately. Instead, it is gradually revealed through the internal limitations of the priesthood belonging to the Levites. In practical terms, this system is built upon a very clear logic. Human beings serve as mediators between the community and God, and because human beings are finite, the mediation itself is also finite. A priest serves for a period of time, then dies, and is replaced by the next generation. This cycle creates continuity, but at the same time produces an endless loop. Every day, every year, sacrificial rituals are performed again and again. Blood is shed, sin is acknowledged, atonement is repeated. Yet it is precisely this repetition that reveals something crucial. There is no definitive endpoint. The system operates, but it does not complete. It maintains order, but it does not eliminate the underlying problem it addresses. The second limitation, perhaps even more profound, lies in the very human nature of the priests themselves. They are not only mediators between God and the people, they are also individuals fully subject to weakness, error, and moral limitation. This generates an internal paradox. How can a finite human being fully represent absolute holiness? It is precisely at this point that the Levitical system begins to reveal its foundational tension. It requires human beings, yet is constrained by their finitude. It demands holiness, yet operates through individuals who cannot attain absolute holiness. From here, a deeper question inevitably emerges. If the goal of the covenant is the eternal reconciliation between humanity and God, can a system rooted in finitude truly achieve it? This theological paradox becomes increasingly apparent. An eternal covenant, by its very logic, requires a mediator who is not bound by time. Yet the existing system provides only mediators constrained by mortality. Priests die, but the system continues. And yet that very continuity exposes the unresolved nature of the problem. This is the point at which the older structure begins to enter a state of internal tension. It does not collapse, but it cannot reach the completion toward which it itself is directed. Within this context, the image of an alternative order, already foreshadowed in the time of Abraham, begins to gain increasing significance. The order of Melchizedek does not depend on lineage. It is not sustained through biological succession, and most importantly, it is not clearly bounded by the cycle of life and death that defines the Levitical system. This opens a structurally transformative direction. If mediation is no longer limited by time, then the very nature of mediation itself changes. It is no longer an individual within a chain of succession, but a more continuous and stable reality. From this point onward, theological thought begins to shift from the model of a physical temple toward a more abstract conception, a transcendent order. The temple, in the older system, is a concrete, bounded space where rituals are performed according to fixed temporal cycles. But as the priestly system reveals its own finitude, the idea of a heavenly temple emerges as a way of expressing a reality not constrained by space or mortality. In this realm, mediation is no longer a repeatedly replaced individual role, but an eternal principle. There is no generational turnover, no interruption caused by death, and no endlessly repeated ritual cycle that never reaches completion. Instead, what remains is a unified structure in which reconciliation is not a repetitive process, but a stable reality. It is within this shift that the tension between the older system and the prophetic promise becomes fully visible. On one side stands a historical structure grounded in human limitation. On the other, a vision of completion that transcends those limitations. And between them, the figure of Melchizedek does not disappear. On the contrary, he becomes more distinct, as a signpost pointing toward the possibility of another order, one that does not merely supplement the old system, but questions the ultimate limits of that system itself. After the limitations of the Levitical priestly system have been fully exposed, its dependence on mortality, its endless repetition of rituals, and its inability to bring a final resolution to the problem of human imperfection, the theological imagination of Israel begins to shift again, not through rejection of the old order, but through the emergence of something that appears to stand both within and beyond it. At the center of this transition remains Moses, the mediator of the law. In the traditional structure, he is not merely a lawgiver, but the architect of a covenantal system that organizes Israel's entire religious, moral, and communal life. The law is not optional, it is foundational. It defines boundaries, establishes categories, and maintains order between the divine and the human. Yet, as the figure of Melchizedek continues to re-emerge in later interpretation, especially through prophetic reflection, a more subtle idea begins to take shape. The Melchizedekian order is not introduced to abolish the law, but to transcend its limitations without negating its purpose. The law of Moses operates within a finite framework. It assumes human failure and responds to it through regulation, correction, and sacrificial cycles. It preserves covenantal order, but it cannot produce final completion. It manages imperfection without eliminating its recurrence. In this sense, the law functions as a structured system of mediation within time, rather than a final resolution beyond time. The Melchizedekian order, by contrast, is not positioned as an external rival. It functions more like a deeper layer of reality, one that fulfills what the law anticipates but cannot fully realize. It does not dismantle the system, it reorients it toward its ultimate telos. This reorientation leads to a fundamental shift in conditions. The basis of priestly authority is no longer genealogy or inherited status, but a different principle altogether: indestructible life. In the Levitical system, authority is inseparable from biological continuity. Priests are born, serve, and are replaced. Death is not an interruption of the system, it is part of its design. The structure depends on succession. Authority is distributed across generations, never concentrated in permanence. But in the Melchizedekian framework, the foundation changes. Authority is no longer derived from descent, but from a quality of existence that is not subject to decay or termination. It is grounded in life that is not interrupted by mortality. This transformation redefines what a priest even is. No longer a temporary office held within a lineage, priesthood becomes an ontological reality, a mode of being characterized by continuity rather than succession. The priest is not simply someone who performs rituals, but someone who embodies an enduring mediatory presence. From this shift, a new conceptual architecture emerges. The first transformation is from law to grace. Law defines structure through obligation, distinction, and repeated correction. It establishes what must be done and what must be avoided. But once the limits of this system become visible, another principle begins to surface, not as the negation of law, but as its fulfillment beyond repetition. Grace introduces a relational dynamic that is not exhausted by failure and restoration cycles. The second transformation is from system to essence. The Levitical order is fundamentally systemic. It depends on institutions, offices, procedures, and regulated time cycles. The Melchizedekian order, however, points towards something deeper than institutional structure. It emphasizes the underlying reality that gives meaning to structure itself. Authority is no longer distributed through institutional inheritance, but grounded in a unified, sustaining principle. The third transformation is from ritual to spiritual reality. Ritual, in the older system, functions as mediation. It repeats symbolic actions to maintain covenantal continuity. But in the emerging vision, ritual is no longer the end point. It becomes a pointer toward an immediate reality in which mediation is no longer fragmented across repeated acts, but unified in continuous presence. Seen as a whole, the Melchizedekian order is not merely a theological alternative to the Levitical priesthood. It represents a reconfiguration of the entire logic of mediation, time, and authority. If the earlier system operates through differentiation, priest and king, sacred and secular, law and life, then the Melchizedekian vision moves toward integration. It does not erase distinctions arbitrarily. It reinterprets them within a larger, more unified framework in which separation is no longer the final principle of organization. In this light, Melchizedek, who first appears only briefly in the book of Genesis, is no longer a marginal figure. He becomes a structural signpost pointing toward a different order of reality. Not an interruption in history, but a revelation of what lies beneath it. A priesthood not bound by lineage, not constrained by death, and not limited by ritual repetition. A priesthood defined instead by the permanence of the reality it mediates. As the theological narrative continues to unfold across the Hebrew Scriptures, the scattered threads that began in the book of Genesis were structured through the law and were refined in prophetic reflection, begin to reveal an unexpected pattern of convergence. What initially appears as separate covenantal moments, each with its own emphasis, logic, and historical context, gradually resolves into a unified trajectory pointing toward a single underlying structure. The covenant with Abraham begins as a promise, a call into the unknown, a declaration of future blessing, and the formation of a people not yet realized. It is expansive, relational, and forward-looking, grounded in faith rather than institutional form. The covenant mediated through Moses introduces an entirely different dimension. Here, divine relationship is formalized through law. Boundaries are defined, behavior is regulated, worship is structured. The emphasis shifts from promise to order, from expectation to obligation, from future vision to present discipline. Then, in the royal dimension associated with David, a third layer emerges: kingship. Authority becomes centralized in a political theological figure who embodies national identity and governance. The covenantal narrative now includes not only promise and law, but also sovereignty. At first glance, these three covenants appear to operate in distinct domains: promise, law, and kingship, each with its own logic and institutional expression. Yet as the interpretive tradition develops, particularly through later theological reflection, these separate strands begin to converge in a surprising way. All three point toward a deeper structural reality that transcends them. That reality is the order of Melchizedek. Within this framework, Melchizedek is no longer a marginal figure appearing briefly in ancient narrative. Instead, He becomes the structural axis around which the entire covenantal system can be understood. He is not one covenant among others, but the point at which covenantal dimensions intersect and find coherence. In this sense, Melchizedek is not an addition to the biblical story. He is its hidden architecture. From this perspective, the entire scriptural narrative can be read not as a collection of unrelated theological developments, but as a progressively unfolding structure. The beginning in Genesis introduces the pattern in hidden form. The Psalms, through prophetic articulation, begin to reveal its contours. The Mosaic Law exposes both the necessity and limitation of structured mediation, and the Melchizedekian order emerges as the conceptual resolution toward which the entire system was moving. Seen in this way, Melchizedek functions not as a historical anomaly, but as a structural key, a lens through which the internal coherence of the biblical narrative becomes visible. He represents the convergence point where promise, law, and kingship are no longer isolated categories, but integrated dimensions of a single theological reality. This leads naturally to a broader conclusion. Melchizedek is not a peripheral detail within Scripture, but a foundational principle that quietly organizes its deeper logic. What appears fragmented at the surface level reveals itself as unified at the structural level. And this unity is not merely literary or symbolic. It carries theological implications regarding the nature of authority itself. If Abraham represents origin, Moses represents structure, and David represents governance, then Melchizedek represents the underlying order that makes all three intelligible. He is not located within the sequence, but beneath it. From this synthesis emerges a final conclusion about authority that transcends time. The Melchizedekian priesthood is not bound by genealogy, institutional succession, or historical limitation. It operates according to a principle that is neither generated by human continuity nor terminated by human mortality. Instead, it exists as a mediating reality between the finite and the eternal. It resolves, at least conceptually, the tension that runs through the entire biblical narrative, the gap between human limitation and divine perfection. Where human systems fragment authority across time, roles, and institutions, the Melchizedekian order suggests a unified form of mediation that is not disrupted by finitude. In this way, Melchizedek becomes the conceptual foundation for a vision of restoration that is not merely historical, but ontological. It is not about improving an existing system, but about revealing a structure in which reconciliation is no longer episodic, but complete. Thus, the final implication of this theological trajectory is profound. The entire biblical narrative, from its earliest origins to its prophetic culmination, can be understood as moving toward the resolution of a single tension, the reconciliation of the finite human condition with the reality of the eternal divine order. And within that movement, Melchizedek stands as both origin and fulfillment, not as a figure confined to history, but as a structural expression of a priesthood that transcends time itself.